Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the Next.js auth bypass vulnerability, which is basically CV 2025-29927. Now, this has been making the rounds. People have been talking about this. It's become a pretty huge issue in the JavaScript community, especially in the Next.js community. There have been so many issues that have been identified. There have been fights that have happened. There have been disagreements between multiple major players like Cloudflare and Vercel and so many others that have been happening. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. It's not really what I'm focused on, but I'm going to focus on the vulnerability itself and how it works. And it's very interesting how the vulnerability has happened or how it has come to be. And I'm also going to talk about how this is identified and some of the impacts that it has. Now, Next.js obviously is something that a lot of you know is a web framework from Vercel. Vercel, I think, is the one that created it, but now it's being used not just at Vercel, but much beyond Vercel as well. It is a pretty popular framework, according to this particular blog by the researcher. I'm not sure if this is the researcher who actually found it. Must be the researcher who actually found it because they have been referenced here. Again, I'm not 100% sure, but it seems pretty legit because they've detailed how this was identified. And this is what they've released a detailed blog post. I'll also share this in the show notes as well. Next.js, like I said, is a very powerful or very large framework. It's become pretty much the de facto framework for web applications that are being developed, especially with vibe coding. So you'll see that 130K stars on GitHub, 9.4 million times a week. It's a super popular framework. It's been promoted extensively by Vercel because their VO UI generator uses Next.js by default. I think Bolt uses Next.js by default. So a lot of these UI generators kind of default to using Next.js and ShadCN and some of these component frameworks. Next.js is based on React, and React has generally had a pretty decent security track record, especially in terms of output escaping, in terms of other aspects of how it can be potentially abused. React has had a pretty decent security track record. Now, Next.js obviously is still relatively new as compared to React. It's based on React, but it is considered to be a full stack framework, really, not just a front end framework. Now, Next.js, the vulnerability really is an authorization bypass vulnerability. And the authorization bypass vulnerability really comes into the way it has happened is because of something called the middleware that Next.js uses. Now, middleware is a very common implementation with a lot of web frameworks. What they do is you have a request coming in from the user side, and then there is middleware that checks the request based on some parameters, and then if everything is found to be okay, then forwards it along to the actual endpoint, and the endpoint gets back with an HTTP response. Now that's typically how middleware works. This is very common in the JavaScript world, with Express. It's very common with Go. It's very common with a lot of different implementations out there. Even in Python, you see middleware being used quite extensively. Now, Next.js uses a middleware that does authorization. So it's basically an auth middleware. Now, auth middleware, you can see that this middleware is used for authorization and function level authorization, right? Should this user be able to access the route? Is the session validated? Is the token validated? Redirects, etc., etc. CSP validation, all of that stuff is done through the middleware. So the way this particular vulnerability works is pretty interesting because what happens is that Next.js essentially adds a header called the x-middleware-subrequest. And this is an HTTP header that obviously an HTTP header coming from the request side is something that the user can potentially tamper and change. But the X middleware subrequest, what it does is that it checks whether it sends the middleware that needs to be applied or not. And if there is a middleware based on the name, it will check whether it validates against that middleware. If it uses that middleware, then it essentially runs this particular function to check whether all the aspects of that request is validated as per the middleware configuration, right? So that is the main utility of this header. Now, apparently it so turns out that if you can put in a specific type of middleware or the middleware name, which is denoted by middleware info.name, if you can somehow guess this value, figure out this value and put it into the x middleware subrequest header, then apparently there is no middleware validation. It basically just bypasses the middleware validation and calls the next response.next, which basically provides a response, which means it pushes it to the actual endpoint, and there is no impact of any middleware on that particular request, which is bonkers. I just did a basic search on what the middleware is used for, and you'll see that Next.js Auth middleware is used for all of this stuff, right? So it's used for route protection, session validation, and it checks out because I didn't only look at perplexity, I also looked at different use cases of the middleware, and this kind of checks out, right? So token implementation, role-based authorization, a lot of the stuff that denote or relate to authorization is basically handled by middleware. And a lot of folks are doing their authorization middleware. In fact, there is a tweet by my good friend Lyran who has basically said that I think Clerk, the team from Clerk, claimed that nobody is doing auth in Next middleware, and literally every single tutorial out there teaches you Next authentication authorization middleware, which is wrong. That people are not using this. People are using this. People absolutely use this. I would use it, right? Because it's very simple. I can just use an existing thing. I don't have to write my own middleware. I would use existing middleware. Now, with this, you'll see that so basically the way this works is that if you can guess the name of the middleware info.name, which is guessable, and of course Next.js is an open source project, you should be able to bypass this, which means that the name of the file and underscore middleware, if you add, you are able to bypass it. So in this case, what these researchers have tried to do is put in pages underscore middleware, and they've been able to access the administrative dashboard of that particular environment. So you'll see that if this was this, it would verification, this would be the path name, and so on. They would redirect to that next URL. So they were able to do this based on multiple requests, multiple nested directories and subdirectories. It has also apparently a sort of recursion depth as well, which is also something that they were able to identify as part of their research. So this, and you'll see that they were able to add a recursive value to say that a middleware request, middleware colon middleware, or this particular path, and then they were able to bypass this, and they were able to gain access to the admin section or dashboards or whatever it is. Now this is pretty big because this affects Next.js projects that are using this, and anyone doing authorization, authentication, or anything in between, or any one of those things is likely affected by this. Apparently, Cloudflare users are not. I'm not sure whether the others are. I'm not sure whether Vercel hosted projects are or not, but Cloudflare apparently is not. So apparently, this is something that you will have to take into consideration if you're dealing with this. There are fixes for this. Next.js 15.x, you'll see the patch versions. And of course, you'll have the sub-request. The patching is not, You also have ability to probably turn off this header or validate this, prevent external user requests having this particular header. This is something. So apparently apps on Vercel, Netlify, and Cloudflare are not affected. So this is good that they have immediately addressed this. But this is a pretty serious issue because while they have basically looked at function or path access or function level access control, the middleware is pretty powerful because it can do a whole bunch of things. It can do session management. You can see that they're using this for session validation, you're using this for token validation, you're using this for a whole bunch of things. So this can be pretty dangerous based on the type of usage of the auth middleware. So this is something to definitely keep in mind. Our friends over at SemGrep have created a rule for this, which is good, which is pretty timely. If you're using SemGrep, definitely look at using this. You need semgrep.dev access. So this is something that you should be looking at. And if you're using Next.js, definitely immediately take stock of this and patch this and test for this, validate this, and then release your application. So this is a pretty huge flaw, and this is something that you need to keep in mind with your own Next.js application if you have one. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you find it useful, and I'll see you in the next one.